Good afternoon, everybody. This is Fabio Nascimbeni from UNIR speaking, and welcome to this fifth webinar of the OpenMed course. This is going to be the last webinar, and as the ones of you following the course will know, this is about open educational practices. We started with open education in general, then we moved to copyright, then OER, then contextualization, since we are targeting especially learners from the Mediterranean region. And now the cherry on the cake, and most probably the most challenging of all of this, open educational practices. And we have a very luxury speaker, I would say, Catherine Cronin. I will let you introduce yourself, Catherine. You have a slide on this. I will just say that Catherine is actually is finalizing a PhD specifically on open educational practices with a very, I would say, interesting look, asking herself why teachers are adopting and should be adopting open educational practices. So this is exactly what we need, because as you know, the OpenMed course is about raising awareness and sort of convincing people to work as openly as possible. So without further delay, I give the word to Catherine, and whenever you are done, or whenever you want to stop for questions, or when you are finished, we can take some questions received through the chat. Thank you again, Catherine, and the floor is yours.
Okay. Thank you so much, and my apologies again, but here we are. I don't know if anybody else saw the super moon this week. It was beautiful in Ireland, and so I had to go find an image of the super moon to start the presentation today. This is not in Ireland, unfortunately, but it's a beautiful picture from the US. As Fabio said, I'm the fifth in 5 webinars, and I follow some people who are very inspiring to me, and some of you may have been at all of the webinars. So Lorna kicked things off with really the philosophy of open and some of the debates that are going on in open education and useful resources. And then Cable, I believe, did the second webinar, Cable Green, about OER, not just about how to do open licensing, but why. Very, very interesting. Bea came on to add a strand about open research. And then Shireen, very interesting, just about open education initiatives in Jordan, kind of an Arab nonprofit MOOC platform, highly interesting to me. So I'm kind of the sweeper coming up at the end, but I'll do my best to share some of my recent research about open educational practices. In terms of who I am, I'm in lots of different places on the web, but probably the 2 best places to reach me, just to engage in conversation is on Twitter. I'm usually quite active on Twitter, and also my website has my blog and publications and those kinds of things. So please feel free. I'd look forward to continuing the conversation after today. And apart from my digital life, in my embodied life, I am originally from New York City, and although I've spent about half my life now in Galway on the west coast of Ireland, so I have made my home here. So like a lot of people in the world, I have a couple of homes. Not physical homes, but spiritual kind of places that I feel connected in the world. I created this slide. I just want to start with this before I get into specifics. I created this slide about a year ago, and I've used it quite a bit in the past year because I think we certainly live in challenging times. Some of us, more so than others, and that be that personally or kind of geographically or regionally, certainly globally. But for me, open education is a very hopeful field to work in. So, as we know, and probably has been alluded to already, open education is in a long line of, a long history, we'll say, of social, political, and educational movements that have sought to increase access to education and to reduce inequality. So, being very clear-eyed about the challenges and the risks, I think we can also feel that this particular field gives us a lot of hope around changing things in terms of recognizing challenging circumstances, working to reduce inequality, and acting to change that through education and through the tools available to us in open education. So I'm very inspired by the field. I'm very inspired by the people who are working in this field, like the 4 people I mentioned at the start, and as well as the wider network of people involved in OpenMed and many other open education initiatives. So I just wanted to start there. As I said, I'm literally days away from submitting my thesis, my PhD thesis in the area of open educational practices. So quite often, as with many of you, maybe people ask, I say, what are you doing your PhD in? And I say, open education, and they say, what's that? So that could be here at the university or in the supermarket or wherever. And I often give some version of an explanation that's captured kind of in this diagram. And you may have seen this diagram before. I just find it quite useful as a visual for talking about some of the issues around open education. So for me, I think we can talk about the broad context that all of us are working in, which is that we live in an increasingly open, networked, and participatory culture. So the image on the left of the screen there was devised by Alec Couros when he did his PhD over 10 years ago, and he talked about this notion of a networked educator. So in formal education, in this case, I'm talking about higher education, networked educators meet networked students in various learning spaces. And, you know, I divide this into 3. Obviously, we could debate about the boundaries and so on, but there are 3 main types of spaces that we typically meet and work with our students. And those are physical spaces, bounded online spaces, and open online spaces. So physical spaces would be classrooms, obviously. Bounded online spaces would be spaces where you must be a member to join, so a VLE or any members-only online space. And open online spaces would be the open web, although obviously there's a gradient of openness, of course. So just a couple of interesting things here is that usually we teach in some combination of these 3. It's not typical that we would be talking about choosing one or the other, but the affordances of the different spaces are important, I think, and certainly in physical spaces and bounded online spaces, the 2 vertical lines there show that it's really difficult to share what we're doing in those spaces with our wider networks or to invite our wider networks into those learning spaces. But those kinds of things are possible in open online spaces. Another thing about this diagram is if we're talking about the context of higher education, for most educators, we are not asked to teach in open online spaces. It's something that we do, that we choose to do. So that is, I suppose, where I started my research from. So, you know, I really am piggybacking off a lot of research that's done. I'll acknowledge as much as I can of it here in the presentation. But, you know, if you think about a lot of the work that's being done in the area of digital education, many people are looking at these different spaces and trying to decide, you know, how best we use digital technologies, you know, for more effective learning, for the sake of students and educators and so on. So my work fits into a much broader context there. So I began with this question a few years ago. I said, in academic settings in which the use of OEP is not required, requested, expected, or specifically supported, why do some educators and not others choose to use OEP? And when they make that choice, then what happens? So that was, you know, like many of the biggest projects we do in life, it starts with a question. So that was my question when I started. And 4 years later, I'm just about to finish my PhD in this area of what I'm calling openness and praxis, Freire's notion of, you know, reflection and action, exploring the use of open educational practices in higher education. So I'll also give a maybe small apology, and that is that because I'm submitting in just a few days, I have been down in the weeds of this research. You can imagine, and I might be a little tired as well. So it's possible, and indeed probable, that I could give a better, maybe more higher level presentation, maybe in a month or 2, after things can sift through. But I'm really happy to do the best that I can today. But if I am getting in the weeds, Fabio, you just tell me and pull me up again, okay? So in terms of the literature, OEP fits with a host of other related concepts. It's not out there all on its own. So I'm citing some of the authors whose work I have used here. So again, Alec Couros again, back in 2010, I think he published his first paper on what he called open teaching, and has published more on that with Katja Hildebrandt. And then it's very similar to what people also call open pedagogy these days. So there's been some fabulous work done in open pedagogy recently, Robin DeRosa, Martin Weller, and others. And that is kind of the current version of open pedagogy, because of course open pedagogy has a longer history from the 1960s and 1970s, but this is open pedagogy in terms of the current open education movement. And then open pedagogy and open education also relate very closely to critical approaches, which I'll talk about more in a minute. So critical digital pedagogy is another very important concept. And then the slightly broader concepts of open scholarship and networked participatory scholarship, which go beyond teaching and learning and really talk about research and kind of a broader definition of scholarship. So all of this, I've drawn from all of this research in my own work in OEP. But when I looked at all the definitions of OEP, if you imagine all the jigsaw pieces, throwing them out on the table in front of us, two of the biggest pieces in terms of what constitutes the most expansive definition of OEP would be OER and open pedagogy. So in the most expansive definitions of OEP, OER is a component, open pedagogy is a component, but not all of these components must be present at the same time. And this is a contentious issue. I'm happy to talk more about this. Other components of OEP include open learning, open publishing, use of open tools, and so on. But we're most often talking about OER and open pedagogy and kind of the relationship between those. And so I will come back to that. Another important piece before I leave the literature and really talk about my findings and my research project is the importance of critical approaches to openness. So there's a growing body of work in this area, critical approaches to openness, and I cite two authors here, Richard Edwards, some really important work from 2015, which I think really crystallizes an important question around any critical approach, which means open for whom, because critical approaches look at things like power and privilege in any processes and systems and structures. And Tracy McMillan Cottom, also another outstanding piece of work, she coined this term about the roaming autodidact in her critique of some of the MOOC research and MOOC developments, in fact, which is that some courses are designed for this nameless, faceless learner, which she calls the roaming autodidact, which assumes the mantle of really white Western maleness. So if we design for this roaming autodidact, who are we leaving out of our initiatives in open education? So again, just a nod to critical approaches to openness. It was very important in my work. So, all right, so all of that is the background, and what I did in a sense was that was the context for my work, but I didn't build a framework for my research from that work. So what I really wanted to do was explore meaning making and decision making on the part of educators in higher education around openness. So not only are you using open educational practices, what does openness and OEP mean to you? How do you define it? What is the meaning of openness to you? And how does it relate with your other pedagogical practices? So my research questions were just as listed there on the slide. The research setting, I want to do a situated study. So I chose one higher education institution in Ireland without a policy around OER and OEP. And my research approach, as I said, was interpretivist. So it really was driven from the concerns of the participants, critical and empirical. So I chose to use constructivist grounded theory. I did semi-structured interviews with 19 members of academic staff across multiple disciplines and all ranges of practice. So, a whole continuum of not open at all to very open. I purposely spoke to people across that spectrum because I really wanted to understand why people didn't opt to use open practices as well as why they did. And then from the emerging grounded theory from those interviews, I designed a questionnaire for a larger number of people. It went out to all academic staff at the institution to gather more descriptive information about some of the the themes and categories that emerged. And I should note also that where I say academic staff there, I used a very, very broad definition of academic staff. So that included full-time and part-time, permanent and adjunct and precariously employed members of academic staff as well. I call them all academic staff. I think all of those perspectives are important. So naturally, the findings were very, very complex and just amazingly diverse. And really, probably one of the big takeaways from this project for me was the privilege of speaking with so many educators who were just deeply committed about their teaching and learning, on creating the best possible opportunities for their students, encouraging critical thinking, and so on, and just how core that was, to so many of the people that I spoke with. And then they would say, and so, this is how I use open practices, and that spectrum was huge, and so I never use, I never engage with students on social media at all. I don't think that's appropriate. Or, and so, I'm blogging with my students, out in open spaces. Really fascinating. So the analysis was very, very interesting. And obviously open is not a binary. So I'm using this notion of the spectrum, or a continuum, as I call it. So if you look at the top banner of the slide there, I'm just using that idea of a continuum from less open to more open. So then, I didn't really put people in boxes, although the slide is constructed like boxes. So of all the digital practices that emerged, kind of what people are doing, 4 main areas fell out: digital identity, digital networking, the digital tools that people use for teaching, and the use of OER. And then in each row, the left and right columns really identify the poles at the extremes. But as I said, there's a continuum of practices all across that. So, let's just look at digital networking, for example. The least open people who had the least open practices with respect to digital networking were not using social media at all. There were a few of those, or using it for personal use only, family and friends, and that's it. And then as we slide over to the more open side of the spectrum, maybe in the middle, you might have people using it personally and professionally, but only just with respect to their research. And then maybe over on the right, you might have people who are interacting with students and peers and the public and so on. So in each of those rows, people were sprinkled across. And also for different individuals, people were at different places. So, people were scattered all over this. But in looking through the entirety of the results, the right-hand column, all the practices kind of on the right, seemed to characterize people who I termed as using open educational practices. So these were individuals, and a lot of these traits show up in other work as well, around open scholarship, network participatory scholarship, some of the work I cited earlier. So people who had open networked resident identities, using Dave White and Donna Lanclo and others' work around visitors and residents, this notion of leaving social traces on the web. Using social media personally and professionally, including with students, using the VLE and email, as well as open tools and social media, and intentionally using OER. So there was a very low awareness of OER at this research site, and there is no OER policy. So, the people who were aware of OER were aware of it because of their own initiative and agency, or maybe particular professional development workshops where they had learned about it. So that was really the what, kind of what it looked like roughly. Then I looked at why. So, and this was really interesting. What were the categories related to the use of OEP? So again, this spectrum of less open to more open, there were 4 categories that were related. And these were privacy, digital literacies, philosophy of teaching and learning, and conception of oneself as a teacher. So privacy, I'll talk about more in a minute, but it was hugely important factor for all of the participants. So, there were some participants who had a strong, or I called even fierce, attachment to privacy in their life, and they were very focused on risks. And over on the more open side of the spectrum were individuals who sought and felt they had achieved a balance between the privacy and ameliorating the risks of openness. They valued both. No one in the study said that they did not value privacy. Everyone valued it, but it was this notion of balance was what came up. In digital literacies, there was surprising initially to me, but then as I studied, I learned it was not so surprising that there was a prevalence of a digital natives discourse among academic staff, from some academic staff. And then on the other end of the spectrum, moving over to the right, there were individual educators who sought to develop their own digital literacies, recognizing that that was part of their, professional work as educators to continually update their skills, their awareness, their knowledge of risks, and so on. Things like platform capitalism and surveillance capitalism, and all these kinds of issues. These things arose in the interviews. And then on the furthest of the openness row of digital literacies were educators who also sought to develop their students' digital literacies as well, viewing that as an important thing for students, embedded in whatever their discipline was. And then philosophy of teaching and learning really ranged, this is quite conventional, from maybe more behaviorist philosophy to more social constructivist philosophy. And again, rarely could you say someone was one pole or the other, but could be placed on that spectrum somewhere. And then the final one was probably the most difficult to get my arms around, and that was conception of oneself as a teacher. So the most open educators, one of their motivations was around, or values, was challenging traditional teaching role expectations. So they were willing to challenge the conventions in what the particular context that they were in. So this is why it really is important to do situated studies, because we can't talk about traditional teaching role expectations unless we understand what those are in a particular discipline or institution or so on. So these educators all sought to challenge those traditional expectations in some way, and there were a variety of ways that people did that. So at the end, there were many educators, for example, who valued social learning. Many, most in fact. There were many who sought to develop digital literacies and so on. But those educators who used open educational practices, what I call the open educators, all of them shared these 4 traits, and if you look at those 4 boxes on the right-hand side, I'll just explore those in a little more depth before I move on to the discussion. So the 4 kind of semicircles here are really just the 4 items on the right in that diagram. So this was, at the heart of the grounded theory model that emerged, in a sense, because what this is saying is these were 4 things that I could identify that motivated educators to use open educational practices according to their own words and how they describe their own practices. So, what this adds to the previous description of these, or that layout, is that there are interrelationships, obviously. So the inner circle, balancing privacy and openness, and developing digital literacies are obviously related. So, unless you have a fairly sophisticated level of digital literacies, it's difficult to figure out ways to balance privacy and openness. And some of the ways educators talked about doing this were having like 2 different Facebook profiles, one personal and one professional, or using Facebook for private and Twitter for professional, or just using different kinds of privacy practices and tools in kind of a nuanced way, so that they could preserve that balance between privacy and openness. And in the outer circle, again, there's a relationship between valuing social learning, seeing oneself as a learner. As one participant said, he expressed the fact of having humility as a learner, not wanting to see himself as up on high as the teacher, so that he wanted to be part of a community of learners. So, and with that set of values, it's more likely that someone might challenge traditional teaching role expectations, for example. One other aspect of this before I move on is that the little note in the lower right-hand corner is the inner circle relates to networked individuals, and all 4 circles relate to our work as networked educators. So what that means is that the inner circle really operates kind of at 2 levels, if you like. So it's almost like there are 6 dimensions. So balancing privacy and openness and developing digital literacies are things that we do as individuals, as citizens, as people who are on the web. But it's one thing to balance privacy and openness as myself, Catherine Cronin, But quite another thing to think about, well, how do I do that if I'm going to be interacting with my students on the open web? That's a whole separate discussion. So, so there's an added complexity around the two, around the inner circle, those two dimensions. Likewise with developing digital literacies. It's one thing to develop one's own digital literacies, but how do you embed digital literacies, in a disciplinary context in which you teach in an appropriate way with your students? So that pink semicircle around balancing privacy and openness, so many of the discussions in the interviews really focused around this. This was an area of utmost concern, I would say, to all of the participants in my study. So I spent a good bit of time analyzing this and trying to figure out where people were making the determinations about whether, how, and how to be open. So in the end, I use these 4 levels, and I've used these in workshops with academic staff and students since then, and they seem to resonate, and I am finding them quite useful in practice, although they arose from my research. So the macro, meso, micro, and nano are, it's a well-known organizing principle for in social research. Macro is the question about, do you use Twitter? Do you have a blog? It's a very high level question, and it doesn't really tell us a lot. And even if someone chooses to use Twitter or chooses to use Hypothesis or whatever else, the interesting questions and the challenging questions are the questions beneath that. So the meso level question is, thinking about your community, is whom will I share with? So, oftentimes when someone says, I'll use Twitter as an example. It was the most common form of open educational practice in my study. Many people start to use it and then say, "Oh, I just couldn't really figure it out. I didn't know what it was about." And this is one of the questions that gets stuck with, and that's who am I sharing with? Am I sharing with my research community? Am I sharing with my students? Am I sharing with people in my community, with my family? So kind of getting clear about who you want to share with, who you don't want to share with, trying to avoid context collapse. And again, using digital literacies to help you figure out then what's the appropriate tool I should use if I want to share with these people and not with those people. The micro level questions around the individual are around who will I share as? And again, this really causes people to pause sometimes in their open practice. So if you think of the voice that you're blogging in or tweeting in or speaking in, am I speaking as a lecturer? Am I speaking as a person in my community? Am I speaking as, a mother? Or, how do I rationalize all these different voices? And, what digital identities will I use? And can I use different kinds of voices, in different platforms? And then the nano level is, once you've done all that work and, have adapted some level of open practice for yourself, the question that even long-term open educators pause at sometimes is, will I share this? So, as I often say, when you're holding that phone and you're thinking about tweeting something with a particular hashtag or saying something around, politics or education or whatever it might be, will I share this? Does this represent me? Who will see it? All of those kinds of questions. So it gets at this notion of, this slide, I think, really encapsulates my final my overall finding, basically, which is that open educational practices are personal because they are around identity and our selves as individuals and as educators and our digital identities. It's contextual, so thinking about who you're sharing with and under what circumstances. It's continually negotiated, that nano aspect of it, continually negotiating your openness. Whether you're new to openness or whether you're a long-term open practitioner. And it's complex, obviously, because all of these things are operating all the time. So, okay, I'm going to wrap up in 2 minutes because I'd love to have time for questions. So yeah, this is what I just said, but I guess I said it with the other slide in mind. So practicing openness or using open educational practices is complex, personal, contextual, and continually negotiated. Why is this important? I think it's obviously, I think some of these tools are useful at an individual level, but in terms of policy, I think it's important, obviously, for institutions to formulate policy and to support staff and students around openness. But if with a true understanding that this is what openness is at an individual level, We can't require openness of staff or students in any way. It's always personal. It's always personally negotiated. So there needs to be space for individuals to practice openness in the ways that are most appropriate for them. So as a small aside, for example, 3 of the participants in my study out of 19 recounted instances of bullying or stalking in their immediate families. And so they were absolutely against using social media in all but the most personal and private of ways. So no matter how many workshops and wonderful talks and everything you might give to those individuals, that is not the choice they're going to make. And we need to respect those choices. And we can't expect that in any given professional interaction, someone would reveal that that's why they feel very private and don't want to use open practices. So, so I think overall, having this understanding around openness is very important. Getting back to the jigsaw pieces on the table, just to finish up with, I ended the study very much in favor of using expansive conceptualizations of OEP. And by that, I mean, some people use a very OER-focused definition of OEP, and I show that here, and that is that, and this is really grown from, the incredible body of OER research, so that many people have studied the fact that if we encourage using, reusing, and creating OER, we can actually facilitate the development of open pedagogy and these collaborative learner-centered practices. So we know that to be true. However, what is arising in my study and some other studies which I have cited there is that in situated studies of OER and OEP, we often find that the reverse is the case, and that there's a lower threshold for collaborative learner-centered practices where people are building off their existing open practices and trying to enhance learning for their students in some particular way. And through those experiences, then come to learn more about OER and that whole kind of body of practices and body of work. So I think it's a much more complex and bigger picture, perhaps, than is sometimes conceived. And finally, I would love to talk about your own practices, your own thoughts, questions, comments. I'd love to extend the work further, but just to get back to the very first slide, I hope the work is important for, I'd love to see some of the findings, which I acknowledge are very situated in one institution. Maybe other people can use them and see if they can be adapted, in different contexts. I'd love to see that. I hope some of the tools are useful for people in their practice, but most of all, I think it's around the whole goal of open education, which is around, advancing equality and keeping integrity and safety in mind in our institutions, because certainly we have to acknowledge the risks as well as the benefits of openness, and again, not gloss over those, but be very frank and honest about what those are. So that is all I have today, and I'd love to hear your thoughts.
Thank you very much, Catherine. This was very enlightening, I think, for most of the people who were, I think for everybody who was commenting in the chat. And virtual clap for you. We can just do this virtually. I have a few questions there, but I would like to ask participants to put down their doubts in the chat, and please feel free to comment and to ask questions. I mean, Catherine has been talking directly to a number of educators, trying to go deep in their brain, if I understand well, to really understand what is triggering the choice of using open. And this is something that within OpenMed we couldn't do with this depth. Of course, it's a project dealing with many universities and many professors, so we give for granted a number of things, and that is I would say a necessary mistake when you want to reach a number of people. But on the other hand, it's important to look at the depth of some research to understand how things are going. So thank you for this. It brings a very important perspective. I will just pick up a couple of questions. The last one, but I think pretty relevant, by Martina. Martina asks, so there is a dynamic interaction between OER and OEP that works at least in 2 ways.
Yeah. Yes, and Yes, Martina. And as I said, I think it was understandable that the OER leading to or fostering open pedagogy or other open educational practices was the first piece of that we saw, because this has emerged very much from the open educational resources movement. But now again, because with this notion of networked educators and networked students, and many of us being networked in our own practice as networked learners, what we're finding in situated studies like mine, and others, is that, you know, individual educators are transferring their skills and their practices from other domains into education, and saying, okay, I use Twitter, you know, or I use, you know, whatever other network it might be, blogging, in my research or in these kinds of practices as a learner. This would be really useful to kind of break down the boundaries between myself and my students. Maybe we could invite other speakers come in, those kinds of things. So particularly in institutions which don't have OER policies, where they might not be, that might not be the avenue in. The avenue in is through this development of open practice, and from there, use and development of OER can happen. And I think that's really interesting. My study is not the only one where that has emerged. It emerged out of the UK OER project. Helen Beetham, I gave the reference, and two recent papers from Centre for Innovation and Learning and Teaching at University of Cape Town. The authors are Laura Czerniewicz, Sukaina Walji, Andrew Deacon, and Michael Glover. I have all the references are in this paper here.
Okay.
So I find it interesting that in different contexts that is arising.
Yeah.
Not just in my Irish context.
Okay, yeah, thank you very much. Well, I personally think that your findings, you say they are pretty situated, but they sort of confirm a number of feelings. I don't say they structure a number of perceptions that many people working in the open education field have, but they structure it very, very well. I have a question by Catherine. In fact, before I comment on this, within OpenMed, as you know, we are at the end of this course, and in this course we are targeting some 70 professors from different universities, and all these universities do not have an open education policy as such. And so we are in the situation where most of the things that professors there are learning to do and they are experimenting in doing, there are a number of activities. The typical comment is, I don't know if then this will become my common practice, my mainstream practice, or will it remain an experiment? And that's what Catherine is asking. In fact, she's asking, what is your view about higher education trying to develop policy to help promote openness? Or in other way, is it possible to have some sustainable open educational practices in an institution that doesn't promote openness, or at least doesn't do it openly, or it is a case lost?
Okay, that's really interesting, Catherine. I will be honest and say that one of my rationales for even doing the PhD, I had been working in open education for some time, was my frustration at being an open education practitioner in an environment without an open education policy, and knowing that all of the initiatives and things that I was trying would only be there as long as I was doing them. It was impossible to embed them more thoroughly in the institution. Now, I think there are different levels that we can address. We could talk about this at a program level, at a discipline level, at an institutional level, and really interesting work by Glenda Cox and Henry Trotter, again from University of Cape Town. They looked at the relationship between agency, structure, and culture. So the culture and policy of a university, how does that relate to individual academics' agency with respect to OER? So if you want to explore that, I think that's a great paper to look at. But what they found in the end was that policy is really just like a hygienic factor. It's good to be there, but it doesn't really encourage practice. So you need both. You need that individual agency and some low-level support, but having the policy, I think, is really an important backdrop and foundation for that.
Okay, thank you very much. A question I got by Christina through Skype has to do with the conditions of teaching in a number of universities in the Mediterranean region. We heard from our colleagues there that sometimes you are facing classes of 400 people. I mean, massive classes, massive cohorts of students, and sometimes also with very different levels of access and digital literacy and so on. So on one side, one could think that openness can be of help in this case, but if you want to go for a tailored openness and networked openness, the way you are telling here, do you think this is a barrier or do you see some way to attack these massive numbers of students? I think in a case they spoke about 800. I mean, it's a massive number.
Yes, and are these adult students, undergraduate students, or are they all distance students?
Because of the numbers, I would think undergraduate, but
yes,
in general.
Okay, well, I'll answer in two ways. One as a researcher from my research, and one is kind of as an open education practitioner. So on the research side, the academic staff, the participants who had the most value for social learning, which means really acknowledging things like peer learning and the fact that not all the learning objectives need to be stated out front, that people will choose their own learning paths and so on. So true social learning it is always a compromise within a university system, but it enables you to look at other avenues. So in other words, you will never be able to reply to everyone's comment in a truly open network, but other people can reply to those. So if that's something that really bothers you because you would lose control of the conversation, then perhaps that's not that's worth reflecting on. In terms of myself as a practitioner, I think that notion of inviting other people into the classroom can sometimes break open the learning. And I used to say to my students that, at the end of the day, I hoped that at the end of their 3 years, 4 years of their program, that they would leave with, with a lot of, that they would have learned very much. They would have made a lot of friends, have some wonderful memories. But the fourth thing is a network, a personal learning network. So from the day they leave, from the day after they walk out of the university, they have a network so they can continue learning, because that's the nature of lifelong learning. So if we hold all the learning away, behind password protected systems, we're not fulfilling our function, I think, as higher education institutions. I think we need to scaffold networked learning for our students, and open educational practices provide a way for us to do that.
Okay, yeah, that's yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's then real life is sometimes even more complicated, but this is possibly the two ways to go. Absolutely. We have a few more minutes to go. I think we shouldn't extend too much, even if we started a bit late for the number of commitments. So I'm asking everybody, if you have questions or comment, to last questions or comments, to put them in the chat. My question actually has to do with advocacy, or to tell it better, let's say our 70 learners have sort of committed that after the course they will try to input a bit of openness, not only in their work but also in their colleagues' work. So the bet of our project is that from mid next year we're going to have 70, let's say, advocates of open education all across the Mediterranean. Now, they have
wonderful.
They have been sort of privileged because they've taken the course through a project and so on. My question to you would be, how, if you had to convince somebody to use open practices, considering that, as you say, it's very personalized, it's impossible to have one recipe that works for everybody. But also considering that you have some clear dimensions, I mean, the identity, the social networks, the resources, and so on. From where would you start from if you had like really one shot to convince a bunch of colleagues to say something that could instill the virus of openness, as well as Martin Weller says? Where would you start from?
That's a great question. I always think that doing it and modeling it are the most important things. So for me, if I was in that situation, what am I working on with my colleagues? Is there something that we can collaborate on? Is there a conference? Is there a new course? Is there a new program element or whatever? And then as we work on that together, verbalize and work through questions like, could this be open? Could the course be open? Could the student handbook be a website online? Why do we lock things away? So questioning and modeling the questioning and sharing resources and so on, because the whole notion of teaching and doing courses or whatever is not really it's not sustainable if you really want to change practice. I mean, I think it can be a prompt for people, but if you really want to scaffold that, it's a matter of sharing the information, using it in collaboration, and then pulling in the resources as you need them.
Okay, well, actually, the idea of working in practice on a course or on something is very inspiring. Instead of presenting potential impact and things that can look a bit far away. So that's a very good idea. Okay, any more question or comment? I see some people are leaving and are thanking you. And let me see if
Thank you so much.
Any other question? Just let me remind you that the webinar will be recorded, and we are actually getting a lot of views on the past recorded webinars. It's very difficult to find a timing that is good with the classes time in the south especially, but this is, let's say, at least not many webinars are seen after the live version, but in the OpenMed case, I have to say that we counted the number of clicks at least.
Well, I have to say you have a very good platform for the OpenMed website, and where you have the webinars and there's the descriptions and you can look at the slides or the videos. So the way it's organized and presented, I think really probably contributes to that.
It is the magic. That is the magic of Cristina Stefanelli, who is here with us.
Well done.
Manager. Yeah, absolutely. No, I have to say, and the whole OpenMed platform. Let's say in terms of people, we were in Alexandria in Egypt last week, working a couple of days with the facilitators and trying to understand how the course is working in every university, and we got a lot of very interesting feedback. And I mean, this is confirming, I don't think you need me to say this, but this is confirming that every time you go into things like open education, and especially in terms of practices, the more we go in depth in the course, the more things become personal. So some people are taking the course in a very different way, but are still taking the course. Some people are coming up with ideas that don't look like open educational practices, but they are. So it's very difficult, to think about let's say a solution, a generalized solution is something you really have to go in depth. I have a comment by Maya saying that she really liked how you define balancing privacy and openness, which is very challenging. I think this is an issue. I mean, I don't know if you want to elaborate on this. If you have, I mean, I don't think here the issue is pushing people to be more open and to care less about their privacy. This is something which is inner to every individual, in my understanding, right?
Yes.
So they must just be made aware of this, probably, to become less rigid and more prone to, let's say, in some cases, adopt, maybe risk a bit more, go a bit out from their comfort zone. But I don't think we should be pushing for openness at any cost, right?
That's right. Yes, because again, it's personal and it's contextual. But I think this model, which I think is what you might be referring to, this has been, even just giving this language. I'm thinking of a workshop with graduate students. So useful, because one of them was saying, "Oh, my advisor was saying I should blog, and they realized that what was holding them back was this micro level. Who will would they have a voice of a student? Is it a voice of a researcher? It's a different voice than the one they had before. And sometimes, because we use a lot of real name networks like Facebook and Google, which want us to have a unified identity across the web, getting the knowledge that we can partition our identities in different spaces in different ways is very empowering.
Yeah.
So just even in very short workshops, using this as a tool has been really useful.
Absolutely. Okay, I see mostly words of thanks to you. So I think we are at the moment of closing. Can you just go back to your Twitter, to your presentation page where your Twitter account is? Because in fact, Catherine is very active in Twitter, and especially she's a great reporter from conferences. I enjoy very much reading reports from conference. So if you if you're not
That's nice to know.
if you are not able to attend one of these important conferences on OER and OEP and let's say EduTech in general, you can by following her on Twitter, you can feel that as you have been there almost. So I suggest you start following Catherine right now. And as I was telling the others, so once you become a fellow of the OpenMed group, you'll be a fellow for a long time. So, and you'll receive most probably some questions through Twitter, so through email about what you are doing and contacts from the region and from elsewhere. So thank you very much, Catherine, on behalf of the OpenMed project, on behalf of the UNESCO chair at UNIR. I think this was a great event. We had some 20 participants, but pretty active. Do you want to say a last word, Catherine?
Yeah, I just want to say thank you, but also, you know, for me, so much of this is about, you know, a conversation where, like, I'm learning all the time. I'm going to submit my PhD in a few days, but it's just calling, you know, it's just drawing a line, and this learning and thinking continues. So, you know, for those of you who are on Twitter, Twitter is a great way to get in touch with me. If you're not on Twitter, my email is on my blog, and you know, I'd be happy to be in touch with anyone who's kind of working through these kinds of questions. I'd be delighted to be in touch.
Perfect. So I just let the conversation go on. That's the most important thing.
Indeed.
Thank you again. And if you have colleagues who couldn't attend the webinar, please let them know that from tomorrow it's going to be on the OpenMed website. And have a nice evening or day, depending where you are. And thank you again, Catherine. Have a nice evening.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Okay, bye. Talk soon, Fabio.
Bye-bye. Yes.